Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the briefing room where we take critical concepts in modern performance management and, well, give you the comprehensive overview. Today, we are locking on to target costing, or TC, as you'll often hear it. It's a concept that's absolutely central to how successful businesses figure out market viability and, drive internal efficiency. Our mission today is really to move beyond just the textbook definition. We're going to unpack the mechanism of target costing, understand why it's such a foundational shift from those, let's say, older traditional methods, and we'll also critically examine its challenges, especially when you try to apply it outside of the typical manufacturing world. We want to make sure that by the end of this deep dive, you have a really solid strategic grasp of how TC dictates profitability rather than just reflecting it after the fact.
Yeah, and it's more than just an academic exercise, isn't it? It's really about business discipline. When you look at how corporate strategy has evolved, target costing signals a pretty profound realignment. Historically, I mean, the whole point of cost accounting was basically to measure your internal effort, materials, labor, overhead. And that final cost number, that became your starting point for setting a selling price.
Right, which leads us straight into that traditional method that target costing aims to replace, the infamous cost plus model. On the surface, it sounds kind of safe, doesn't it? Make sure your costs are covered, then just add a percentage on top to guarantee a profit. Simple.
It sounds safe, I agree, but it's structurally quite weak, especially in today's competitive global market. Cost plus, it operates from the inside out. You calculate all your costs first, then you slap on your desired markup. It guarantees a profit if you manage to sell it, sure, but it completely ignores whether the market will actually bear that price.
And our sources flag two really fundamental problems with doing it that way. Problems worth spending a moment on. The first one is just market relevance, right? In today's world, it's hyper-competitive. If you meticulously add up all your costs and you land on a price, let's say $80, but the customer only sees the value at $65, or they can get something similar for that price, well, your internal calculation doesn't really matter much then, does it?
Exactly. That's flaw number one. The price you end up with is often one that customers just will not accept. So that forces you into discounting, which eats away at that guaranteed profit. Or worse, you're stuck with piles of unsold inventory. Cost plus sort of acts like a business is operating in a vacuum. We're competitors and what customers can actually afford. It's like they don't exist. It assumes price doesn't really affect demand.
And the second flaw is more organizational, isn't it? It touches on why we study this in performance management. It's about managerial motivation, or maybe the lack of it. If the management team knows that whatever their final cost ends up being, they just get to add their standard, say, 30% or 40% margin on top, what's the direct, immediate pressure to actually reduce that cost in the first place?
Practically none.
Yeah.
And in fact, cost plus can sometimes inadvertently incentivize more spending. Why? Because if costs creep up, maybe because of a bad purchasing decision or perhaps outdated factory processes, management can often just nudge the final selling price up to keep that same desired margin percentage. It ends up rewarding internal inefficiencies by just passing that cost burden onto the customer. It creates this kind of organizational inertia where there's really no strong incentive to innovate in cost reduction because profitability seems preserved just by raising the price, assuming the market takes it.
That point rewarding inefficiency that feels critical. It makes cost plus a fundamentally passive way to think about profitability. Target costing, on the other hand, it's aggressively proactive.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's the market-driven solution that flips the entire accounting way of thinking on its head. Instead of that passive equation, cost plus profit equals price, target costing imposes discipline right from the start by beginning with the market constraint. The strategic formula becomes target selling price, which comes from the market. The required profit equals the target cost, which is your internal goal. That target cost is the absolute maximum amount the product is allowed to cost if it's going to be strategically viable. It pushes market reality right back into the design room, into engineering.
I find that idea, flipping the paradigm, really powerful because it fundamentally shifts the whole organization's perspective, doesn't it? You're essentially reverse engineering profitability. You start not with what you can do internally, but with what the customer is willing and able to pay. Why is that external market focus so crucial as a starting point for modern strategic management?
Well, because the market is ultimately immutable. Your internal costs, those are things you can control or at least influence.
Yeah.
But the market price, that's dictated by competition, supply, demand. Generally, you don't control that nearly as much. Target costing makes sure that costs are managed proactively to meet market demands, rather than the company just hoping the market will somehow absorb whatever costs it happens to incur. This really shifts the cost function. Accountants move from being just historical record keepers, which is what traditional accountant often is, to being strategic partners in product design and engineering.
So target costing becomes this critical bridge, doesn't it? Directly linking strategic market intelligence, what customers want, what they'll pay directly to the internal operational cost management work. It makes cost management a strategic driver, not just some report you look at afterwards.
Precisely. And this makes target costing a kind of ultimate strategic gatekeeper. If the market research really clearly establishes a ceiling price, and management sets a firm required profit level, and the resulting target cost is mathematically lower than what you estimate the actual production cost will be, then the product, at least in its current form, is basically a failure before it even starts. The discipline of TC demands that the project has to be redesigned or maybe even scrapped entirely.
Wow, that sounds like a massive commitment to market discipline. Actually walking away from a product, maybe after sinking significant resources into R&D just because you can't close that gap between your estimated costs and the target cost.
That is the commitment. And it really highlights the difference, doesn't it? Failure being discovered when you try to sell it, that's cost plus, versus failure being predicted right back at the design stage, that's target costing. TC forces that painful decision up front, potentially saving the company from disastrous losses later down the road.
Okay, let's try and ground this with that analogy we talked about. Contrasting the traditional approach with TC, we had the two food entrepreneurs, right?
Right. So think of the traditional chef, the cost-plus mindset. They start with maybe expensive, high-quality ingredients. Let's say they total $18 for a fancy ravioli dish. They then add their guaranteed $5 profit, arriving at a $23 price tag. Their hope is that the amazing quality justifies the price. But if the local market cap for a pasta lunch is, say, $17, well, they've designed a product that's strategically unviable from day one. They're essentially cost-justifying their price.
And crucially, their operational team has zero incentive to find maybe cheaper yet still perfectly acceptable sources for those $18 ingredients because the margin seems protected by that high price tag.
Correct. Now, contrast that with a market vendor who's using target costing. They figure out, maybe through just watching people through market knowledge, that the absolute maximum price people will pay for lunch in that spot is $15. And they know their shareholders, or maybe just their own bank account, demands a $5 profit from every lunch sold.
Okay, so $15 target price minus $5 required profit dictates that the absolute maximum allowable cost for everything, ingredients, labor, overhead, is $10.
And this completely flips the mission, doesn't it? The vendor isn't asking, how much does my existing product cost? They're asking, how can I source, design, and produce a perfectly acceptable, high-value $15 lunch using resources that cost me no more than $10? That proactive pressure forces creativity, it forces value engineering, it forces strategic supplier relationships right from the get-go. That's the essence of target costing discipline.
But I have to challenge this a bit before we move on. If the vendor is pressured so hard to cut costs, say from an initial estimate of $12 down to that hard $10 limit, doesn't target costing inherently risk compromising the quality or the function that the customer actually expects for that $15 market price? Is there a danger of designing out customer value along with the cost?
That is an excellent and, frankly, a necessary challenge. Yes, if target costing is poorly executed, absolutely there's a risk of sacrificing quality, or what we sometimes call value erosion. However, the fundamental idea of target costing, when it's done correctly, is inextricably linked to value engineering. You're not just blindly cutting costs, you're supposed to be assessing function. The question becomes, which costs contribute directly to what the customer values, and which are just inefficiencies that the customer is ultimately unwilling to pay for? The goal is to design out the non-value-adding costs, not the critical customer features. If cutting a cost means the product no longer satisfies the market need at $15, well then either the initial target price research was flawed, or maybe that product just shouldn't be made at all. The system is actually designed to identify that potential conflict early on.
Okay, that clarifies the strategic risks involved there. So now let's really get into the step-by-step methodology. For organizations actually implementing this, what's the logical sequence they need to follow for the target costing calculation? This is where the discipline gets quantified, right?
Right. It's a structured three-step process. It's designed to quantify that external constraint, the market price, and translate it into a clear internal mandate.
Step 1, determine the target selling price. And this is where, as you said, market intelligence is absolutely paramount.
Precisely. Unlike cost plus, where the price is just an outcome, here the price is the primary input. It has to be determined first. based on rigorous, sophisticated market research. And this means not just, looking at your nearest competitor's price tag. It involves analyzing things like price elasticity, what competitors might launch soon, perceived customer value, and critically, forecasting the expected sales volume. The goal isn't just finding a price, it's finding the price point needed to achieve the company's long-term desired market share. This often means setting quite an aggressive, maybe lower price to break into a new market segment.
Okay, so the price gets locked in based on those external forces before anyone even starts calculating the internal cost structure. Once that market-dictated price is secured, we move to step 2. Determine the required profit.
Yes. Management has to establish the required profit level the company demands from this specific product line or project. And this profit, it has to be enough to provide the necessary return to shareholders, to fund future growth, and, importantly, cover the cost of the capital being used.
And this profit part can be measured in 2 main ways, right? One seems pretty simple, the other may be more complex and strategic.
Correct. The first and simplest way is just setting a required profit margin, usually expressed as a percentage of the selling price. So let's stick to our easy example. If market research sets the target selling price at $20 and the company mandates, say, a 40% gross profit margin.
Okay, that means the required profit is $8 per unit. 40% of $20. So that's the absolute minimum profit they have to make on each unit to justify the product's existence by that measure.
Yes, exactly. That method is clean, it's easy to understand, especially for high volume, maybe lower capital products. However, the second method, and this is the one that really connects target costing to long-term corporate finance and strategic viability, is calculating the required profit based on a predetermined return on investment ROI goal.
Okay, tell us a bit more about this ROI method. Why is it considered strategically superior, especially for major projects?
Because it forces a comparison not just between price and cost for one unit, but between the overall profitability of the project and the amount of capital that's tied up in making it happen. Think about products that need significant capital spending up front, maybe a new factory, specialized machinery, huge R&D investments. For those, management must calculate the total profit required to achieve a specific fixed pre-tax ROI goal, maybe say 30%, on all that capital employed.
Right, so this moves the analysis from just looking at margin per unit to looking at the overall strategic justification for using shareholder funds in the first place. It answers that question. Is this product generating enough return to satisfy our financial stakeholders, given the risk and the sheer scale of the investment?
Exactly right. Let's use a slightly more detailed illustration to make it clear. Imagine a company is launching a completely new line of industrial components. The projected capital investment, including all the equipment, tooling, initial inventory, necessary R&D, let's say it's $5 million. If management sets a target ROI of 30%, then the total annual required profit the project must generate is $15,000. That's 30% of the $5 million investment.
Okay, so now we have the total required profit figure for the year. How do we get that down to the required profit per unit? That's what we need for the target cost calculation, isn't it?
That's where sales forecasting comes in. And this, admittedly, is often difficult and risky, especially early in a product's life. But let's suppose the market research estimates annual sales volume at 40,000 units. We just divide the total required annual profit, $4,500,000, by the expected sales volume, 40,000 units. And that gives us a required profit per unit of $37.50.
Got it. Okay, so $37.50 per unit is the critical profit component we need for the next step. If, going back to step 1, market research determined the target selling price for this industrial component absolutely must be $67.50 to hit the market share goal, well, now we have all the pieces for the final calculation.
Precisely. And you see how the ROI calculation ties the viability of the product directly to the size of the investment. If those sales forecasts suddenly drop, or maybe the capital required turns out to be higher than expected, then the required profit per unit must rise, which in turn makes the target cost even stricter, even harder to achieve. It links the accounting decision directly to the capital budgeting decision, which is absolutely crucial for long-term value creation.
Which naturally brings us to step 3. Calculate the maximum allowable cost, which, as we've said, we call the target cost. This is the simple subtraction part, mathematically, but it represents the single most significant constraint imposed on the operations and design teams.
It is the ultimate boundary. It's the iron gate, really. Using our ROI-based example, $67.50 target price minus $37.50 required profit per unit based on ROI equals $30. That $30 is the target cost. It is the absolute non-negotiable maximum the product is allowed to cost, covering everything from design labor, raw materials, manufacturing overheads, the lot. If the best estimate of the actual cost comes in at $30.01, the project technically fails the market viability test, as defined by the company's own strategic goals.
And this whole process forces that proactive cost management you mentioned. Before target costing, management might be asking, okay, how can we raise the price to cover our rising costs? But under TC, the only question they can ask is, how on earth can we reduce our costs to meet the market price while still hitting our profit target?
That's the key distinction. And the crucial final step, once that target cost is calculated, is the comparison. You estimate the actual cost of production based on the current design, current capabilities. If that estimated cost is higher than the target cost, like $34 versus $30 in our example, the project is only viable if that gap, that $4 gap, can somehow be closed through innovation and efficiency improvements. This is the ultimate gatekeeper function of target costing. It stops the company from pouring millions into developing and launching a product that is essentially doomed from the start to fail to deliver the required returns.
This is where I imagine companies must feel a lot of pressure to negotiate. I mean, how often, in your experience, do companies really stick rigidly to that boundary? Or do they immediately start debating whether that $37.50 required profit is maybe too high for the current market conditions, trying to fudge the numbers a bit?
Oh, that tension is absolutely constant. And it's where management discipline is truly tested. If a company often compromises on the required profit target just to make the numbers work, well, then target costing stops being a proper strategic tool. It just reverts to being a slightly modified cost-plus system. Maybe a price minus whatever profit we can squeeze out equals cost we should try to hit system. Successful TC implementation really requires unwavering management commitment to that ROI target. They have to acknowledge that if they lower the profit expectation, they're effectively telling their shareholders that this project is less valuable than they originally mandated. So good target costing cultures resist that margin negotiation and instead focus relentlessly on pursuing genuine cost reduction.
Okay, so let's assume management holds the line. The target cost is set at $30, but the engineers come back and say, look, based on the current design, we estimate the cost will be $34. Now we have a significant $4 target cost gap. This is the point where, as they say, the rubber really meets the road. So what exactly is the target cost gap, and how does the organization strategically go about dealing with this deficit?
Yeah, the target cost gap is simply defined as the excess of that estimated actual cost over the maximum allowable target cost. In this case, $34 minus $30 equals $4. It's basically the measure of your operational deficiency relative to what the market requires for you to be profitable. And closing that $4 gap, it requires much more than just, simple departmental budget cuts. It usually demands fundamental redesign and innovation.
And the core principle here, it needs emphasizing, doesn't it? You can't easily cut costs that have already been incurred. Most managers might think about cost cutting when things are actually being manufactured, but by then, the design elements, the material specified, the complexity of assembly, the choice of tooling, they've already locked in maybe 80 to 90% of the product's entire life cycle cost.
That is the absolutely essential insight that links target costing to another key concept, life cycle costing. TC pushes the cost management pressure upstream, right back into the design phase. Life cycle costing recognizes that a product's total cost accumulates all the way from R&D and design through manufacturing, distribution, operations, maintenance, and eventually disposal. So if you really want to meet the target cost, you have to manage costs across that entire spectrum, but particularly right at the beginning in design.
Okay, so we need to focus on strategies that fundamentally change the product or the process before we commit to mass production. What specific techniques do companies use to actively reduce costs during that design phase to try and bridge that target cost gap?
Well, the primary tool used to close the gap in the design phase is something called value engineering, VE, or sometimes value analysis, VA. This is a really rigorous, systematic approach, usually involving multiple disciplines: design, engineering, marketing, cost accountants. It's aimed at finding a high-value but lower-cost way to achieve the required function of the product. It relentlessly asks, what is the function the customer is actually paying for, and how can we deliver that function at the lowest possible cost without sacrificing value?
That brings up a great example we discussed. If we're designing a chair, the core function is, well, seating the human body comfortably. A non-value-added cost in that scenario might be having, say, 17 different types of screws needed for assembly. That just increases complexity, inventory costs, assembly time.
Exactly. A value engineering team would scrutinize every single component. They might find that reducing the number of screw types from 17 down to just 3 significantly cuts purchasing costs, warehousing space, and assembly time. And crucially, it does this without affecting the chair's core function or how the customer perceives its value. Other VE methods might include things like 1. Material substitution. Replacing expensive or complex materials with simpler, maybe newer, high-performance alternatives. For example, using specialized plastics instead of machined metal, if the function is maintained. 2. Standardization. Reducing the variety of parts used across different product lines. This lets you leverage economies of scale when you buy components. And 3. Process streamlining. Redesigning the product so it requires fewer manufacturing steps or maybe fewer complex assembly procedures, perhaps allowing for more automation.
Right. That design-focused innovation strategy is so crucial. You used an example earlier that demonstrated the financial payoff of making this kind of upfront investment in design. Let's revisit that quickly just to add some depth.
Certainly. So consider a product with an expected lifetime sales volume of 50,000 units. The initial estimated lifecycle cost per unit is $7.80, but the target cost has been set at $7. So there's an 80-cent gap per unit. Now, the management team discovers that to close this gap, they need to spend an additional $20,000 up front on some highly specialized design software and maybe hire some extra prototyping staff. This increases the initial R&D cost.
Okay, that seems counterintuitive at first glance, doesn't it? Spending more money upfront in order to save money overall.
But the investment is highly strategic if it works. That extra $20,000 when you spread it over the expected 50,000 units adds an initial $1.40 per unit to the lifecycle cost. However, if that investment successfully simplifies the manufacturing process, let's say it reduces the recurring manufacturing cost from $6 down to $4.80 per unit. That's a saving of $1.20 per unit every time one is made.
Ah, okay. So the initial cost increase is $0.40, but the recurring cost saving is $1.20. The net life cycle saving is therefore $1.80 per unit, $1.24. And that closes the original $1.80 gap perfectly. The product moves from being strategically non-viable to actually being profitable according to the target.
Exactly. It emphasizes that effective cost management is about total system costs, looking across the entire life cycle, not just minimizing immediate expenses you see today. Target costing compels companies to look at those cost trade-offs over time.
Now, once the product design is finalized, the gap is closed, the target is met, does the cost pressure just stop there, or is target costing also linked somehow to continuous improvement after the design phase?
No, the pressure absolutely never stops. Or at least it shouldn't. And this is where target costing connects nicely to the concept of Kaizen costing. Target costing sets the initial necessary goal to make the product viable in the first place. Kaizen costing then ensures continuous cost reduction throughout the product's subsequent manufacturing life.
Right, Kaizen, the Japanese term for continuous improvement. It's fundamentally about small-step ongoing refinement, isn't it?
Exactly. So even after a product hits its initial target cost of, say, $30, the market inevitably keeps moving, competitors get better, maybe input costs change. Kaizen costing focuses on achieving small, incremental cost reductions year after year, maybe aiming to reduce the cost from $30 down to $29.80 in the first year of production, and then maybe $29.50 in the second year. This helps maintain the competitive edge and potentially increases the profit margin over time, even if the target selling price has to remain fixed or even decreases slightly due to market pressures.
Okay, so target costing provides that initial, often quite large structural cost reduction through clever design. And then Kaizen costing maintains the continuous incremental efficiency mandate throughout the product's maturity phase. It's like a complete cost management ecosystem. But we absolutely must reiterate that final discipline check. If, after deploying extensive value engineering, maybe exploring radical redesigns, exhausting all reasonable possibilities, if the company can only get the estimated cost down to, say, $32, and the target cost remains firmly at $30, the company must accept the verdict of the strategic filter.
If the gap is genuinely unmanageable, the product gets scrapped. And that painful decision, as tough as it is, reinforces the entire strategic discipline of target costing.
It ensures that valuable capital and resources are not diverted to a product that will either fail to achieve the required ROI for shareholders or maybe necessitate a price hike that guarantees it will fail in the marketplace due to low sales volume. #TagV. Challenges in service industries. Okay, target costing feels like it was almost tailor-made for tangible manufacturing, doesn't it? Where you have standard units, you can measure inputs precisely, you have clearly defined material costs. But when we shift our focus to service industries, whether that's a law firm, a consulting business, a hospital, maybe a financial advisor, The application seems fundamentally harder. Why is it so much more challenging to apply this kind of rigorous costing discipline to something essentially intangible?
Yeah, our sources clearly highlight that service businesses tend to possess 5 key characteristics that really blur the lines for cost definition, target pricing, and even just measuring the output. These distinctions make that objective 3-step calculation process of target costing extremely complex, maybe even impossible, to apply with the same kind of precision you might get in manufacturing.
Okay, let's run through these 5 characteristics then and maybe link each one back to why it makes establishing a reliable target cost so difficult. We start with intangibility.
Right. Services are intangible. You can't physically hold them, measure them easily, or put them in inventory. When a car manufacturer sets a target cost, they can measure the exact weight of steel needed, count the number of components, time the labor minutes required for assembly. Very precise.
Mhm.
But when a law firm provides legal advice, what is the unit of output? It's not a physical object you can count easily. This makes defining a standard unit of service output incredibly subjective. How do you apply a consistent target cost to an output you can't really objectively measure or count?
Right. A law firm might bill by the hour, sure, but the client isn't really paying for 60 minutes of time. They're paying for a successful outcome, or expert guidance, or a problem solved. That opacity makes setting that crucial initial target selling price step one much harder based on perceived value.
Precisely. If customers are ultimately paying for the value delivered, like winning a court case, that value is really hard to standardize and price objectively upfront, which target costing requires.
Okay, next characteristic, inseparability or simultaneity.
This just means that the production and the consumption of the service happen at the same time. Think of a consultation, a medical procedure, even an airline flight. The customer is often present, sometimes actively participating in the service delivery process. This dynamic means that service cost structures are often heavily weighted towards fixed capacity costs, like the consultant's salary time, the expensive surgical room being available, and direct labor. The cost is inextricably linked to the specific time of delivery, making it much harder to standardize and manage cost independently of that direct customer interaction.
Yeah, unlike a factory, which can run 247 making products regardless of who buys them later, here, the cost is incurred the very moment the service provider engages with the client. There's no buffer.
Yes, and that tight integration leads directly into the third big issue, variability or heterogeneity.
This is the quality control problem, essentially. 1,000 manufactured widgets off a production line should be virtually identical, but 1,000 legal consultations or 1,000 haircuts are almost certainly not going to be the same.
Exactly. The quality and the exact delivery of a service can vary widely, even sometimes with the same provider on different days. Consider a complex medical surgery. The cost, and just as importantly, the outcome can fluctuate wildly based on the specific patient's needs discovered during the procedure, maybe the surgeon's energy level that day, unforeseen complexities, even the support staff's efficiency in that moment. This inherent variability makes establishing a consistent standard actual cost, that's the number we need to compare against the target cost, incredibly difficult to forecast accurately and manage reliably. Target costing thrives on predictability. Many services are inherently unpredictable to some degree.
Okay, moving on to the fourth characteristic, perishability. This really speaks to capacity utilization, doesn't it?
It does. Perishability simply means services cannot be stored. An empty seat on a plane, a vacant hotel room for a night, that potential revenue's lost forever. A financial consultant's hour with no client booked is wasted capacity that can't be saved for later. You can't put that unused resource on a shelf and sell it on a busy day like you could with a physical product. For service businesses, recovering their often high fixed costs becomes utterly dependent on achieving high utilization rates. This added complexity in capacity planning and demand management makes cost allocation very unpredictable, particularly when you're trying to accurately estimate the cost per unit of service across fluctuating volumes.
Yeah, if a hospital calculates it needs 80% bed occupancy to meet its financial targets based on some kind of target costing approach, but actual utilization drops to 60% due to external factors like a mild flu season, their entire cost recovery model can break down much faster than in a manufacturing firm that can perhaps build inventory during slow periods.
Exactly. And then finally, the fifth distinction, no transfer of ownership.
Right.
When you receive a service, the customer pays for an action or an experience or access to expertise, but they don't take physical possession of a tangible asset at the end. This fundamentally affects how customers perceive value and, crucially, what price they might be willing to accept. If I buy a car, I own the car. If I pay for a detailed consulting report, I only own the information on the paper, not the consultant's underlying expertise, capacity, or capital. This more subjective nature of value perception further destabilizes that critical first step of target costing, setting a reliable, objective target selling price based on market perception of a service that isn't actually owned.
So when we put all five of these distinctions together, intangibility, inseparability, variability, perishability, and the lack of ownership transfer, it becomes really clear why that rigid, formulaic target costing method we discussed earlier really struggles in the service world. The very foundations it relies on, a standard unit of output, a predictable actual cost, an objectively perceived market price, they're all much shakier, much more complex in a service environment.
Absolutely. While the underlying philosophy of market-driven cost management is still incredibly important, maybe even essential for service firms, the strict three-step calculation method is extremely hard to implement reliably or with precision. Service firms definitely need to adopt the target costing mindset, starting with the price the market will bear and working backwards, but they usually have to rely on broader cost management strategies. Things like benchmarking against competitors, rigorous capacity planning, maybe activity-based costing to understand drivers, rather than precise value engineering on a clearly defined product component that you can easily measure and modify. #TagioSaken, Dennis Stiesvoltelators.
Conclusion and final invitation. Well, this has been a truly comprehensive exploration of target costing. We've definitely seen that it's far more than just some accounting calculation. It's really a rigorous, front-loaded approach to ensuring strategic viability.
It really is. I think the fundamental takeaway is that target costing enforces discipline by accepting the market price as the ultimate starting point, the ultimate constraint. This market-led approach then forces internal efficiency using tools like value engineering, and it acts as that decisive pre-production filter we talked about. It helps ensure that a company's limited resources, capital, people, time, are only committed to products that can strategically achieve the required return on investment. It demands innovation right back in the design phase, before you ever start manufacturing, actively questioning and designing costs out of the product's entire life cycle.
So essentially, we move from being reactive to our costs, just reporting them, to proactively managing our costs to actually guarantee profitability in what's often a very demanding market environment. What final, maybe provocative thought should our listeners take away regarding the real strategic power of this concept?
Perhaps that target costing really challenges the inherent, maybe understandable arrogance of purely internal accounting or engineering perspectives. It reminds every department, from design to procurement to manufacturing, that costs are not just a matter of internal preference or technical comfort. Costs are a strategic variable that must ultimately submit to the external demands and realities of the marketplace. So the true power of TC isn't just in finding that initial target cost number. It's the continuous, system-wide management pressure it creates to question every single dollar spent. It turns cost management into a perpetual, ongoing pursuit of efficiency and ultimately customer value.
That's a powerful perspective to end on. Thank you. If this helped you understand target costing better, make sure to subscribe to the SmartPass YouTube channel for more ACCA performance management audio lessons and smart study insights.